Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the question, what is the philosophy of war? Now, the philosophy of war, is the subset of political philosophy. It focuses on both metaphysical questions about war as well as moral questions regarding war. These include things like what types of things war and peace are, when, if ever, war is justified. Are there moral ways to conduct war, or is all war in some way immoral? In this video, we're just going to give a brief introduction to a couple of the big questions that the philosophy of war looks at, and very briefly look at 7 different positions in the philosophy of war that we may explore in greater depth in future videos. So this is just a bit of a primer to give you a bit of a sense of some of the questions philosophers ask when they're talking about war. So, one question in the philosophy of war is, what type of thing is war? Is it something that is in some way inevitable? Is it a natural state of the world? Is it a necessary state of the human condition that is only broken up by brief periods of peace? Or is it something that can be eliminated, that can be eradicated, that is abnormal, or not something that is something we can expect to always live with? This question often gets tied up with the moral question of whether or not war should exist at all, but we're going to treat these two topics separately. This first one focused on the metaphysical status of war as a thing that may be inherent and natural, or may be non-natural, or something that can be eradicated. And then we're going to take a look at the moral question. Those who think war is the inevitable state of humanity in some way, there are a number of different shades of this, are often called war conservatives. Sometimes these are called realists, but we're going to use realists for the term relating to morality and use conservatives here. And those who think that war can be eliminated, we're going to call war abolitionists. So what do those positions really look like? Well, war conservatives think that war is inevitable. The war conservative tradition can be traced back to Plato, who argued for the need for a state that must be organized for violent survival in a naturally warring world. And in the Republic talks about the importance of defense as well as things that were garnered to a certain degree from his experiences with the Peloponnesian Wars. Several scholastics, credited with developing the just war theory, still argued that while peace was the goal, it must be achieved through war, and war was a necessary condition in some way to get to peace. Machiavelli argued that war was an inevitable consequence of malign fate, and that states should always prepare for a violent defense because war is in some way inevitable. Hobbes, of course, argued for the human propensity for war will always exist where there is no superior force to ensure that war does not break out, in some way that war is natural, a natural state of humans. And Hegel argued that war was an essential part of the dialectic of ideas. It was a mechanism by which society progresses. So there are a range of different philosophers throughout history that have argued for various reasons that war is in some way inevitable. Note that many of these philosophers weren't actively advocating for war, as we'll see later, but rather making the case that no matter what you do, war will in some way break out. Now, war abolitionists, on the other hand, argue and argued that war can be eliminated. A society without war, to the abolitionist, is possible. Abolitionists often overlap with pacifists who think war is never moral, though not always. Some abolitionists might think that war is required to reach a future state of complete peace. And even others, some modern abolitionists, including Bertrand Russell, have argued that the threat of thermonuclear war is a method for achieving lasting peace, so long as the threat of mutually assured destruction is sufficiently publicized. People in this camp have argued that the so-called long peace following World War II is at least in part due to the threat of thermonuclear war between the great powers in the world, and that threat of war has led to the possibility of a lasting peace, of a world without major, large-scale wars. Now, So that was the positions around what is war. Next, we're going to take a look at some of the questions around whether or not war is moral. So another closely related question to what type of thing war is the question of whether or not war is moral. Is war always just because there are no larger institutions than the state to prevent it? Because there's no police officer of the world going around and telling powerful countries that they can't wage war? Are their wars always just? Is there no higher authority for a country to appeal to? Or, on the other hand, is war never just because it causes so much harm and suffering, because it requires murder of people, and in doing so, if murder is wrong and making others murder for you is wrong, it seems that in some way war could never be justified if you think that murder is never justifiable. Or, contrary to either position, are there some situations in which war is justified and others in which it's not? So let's take a look at these three positions. So first off, we have something called war realism. It's also called political realism. And it can be summed up in the claim that all's fair in love and war, minus the love part. In other words, all war is moral or justified because there is no greater moral authority than the state to judge what is right and wrong. There's no institution that can stop war above countries, since countries are the highest level of autonomous gatherings of people and collectives, other than the countries engaged in the war themselves. So there's no institution that can judge if it is just or not, from a somewhat legalist perspective. However, there are few philosophers that hold this position. Perhaps philosophers who are anti-realists about morality in general don't think that it's possible for us to call a war immoral, and so might in some way fit into this category of saying that there isn't a distinction we can make between just and unjust wars, and we can't go after a country that is fighting a war and say they are doing something wrong, because we can't say anything about morality. So there are some philosophers that would fit into this, but it's fewer than the other positions. So another position that some philosophers, though once again not as many, hold is pacifism, which is at the other end of the spectrum from war realism. This is generally the position that war is never justified. Or, in the immortal words of Edwin Starr, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing, which I've had stuck in my head the entire time I've been making this video. War is always morally wrong for the pacifist. This might be a consequence of the belief that killing is always morally wrong and war involves killing. It might be driven by the claim that war is a unique kind of horror that causes so much pain as to never be justifiable. So we talked about earlier, if you believe that murder is always wrong and you think that war is something that requires people to do murder, then you're going to have at least some level of intuition that war is always wrong, or war is always immoral. Now, the final position on this question is often called just war theory. This is the claim that there are some situations in which war is justified and others where it's not, and we can give necessary and sufficient conditions for what makes a war justified and what makes one unjustified. This theory originated with the scholastics, such as St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who argued against the realists that there was a higher authority to judge the start and conduct of wars, the church, or God. Many philosophers have adopted this view over time, including many who have replaced a particular religious tradition with morality in general, a general universal morality, or international law. Check out our very old series on just war theory. It was one of the first series we did on the channel for more on this position. Now, you might have shades of gray in between just war theory and something like pacifism if you had someone that thought maybe war is always bad, but there are certain degrees of which we can say war is bad. So maybe war is always a bad thing, but there's certain kinds of wars that are kind of like, stealing a lollipop from a candy store, and other wars that are similar to committing genocide. So the pacifist might adopt some levels of just war theory in saying that there are shades of gray. All of them are bad, but there are some that are more bad, while the just war theorist is saying that there are some wars that are morally acceptable, full stop. Now, Within just war theory, there are several categories of views, including traditionalists and revisionists. Traditionalists, or legalists, think the morality of war is based on international law. If a particular war or the conduct of a war is in violation of international law, then it is unjust. If it conforms to those laws, it is just. For the traditionalist, the higher law is the international community that can judge states. So this is in some ways a direct answer to the realist that says in some ways there's no higher authority that can judge countries. And setting aside the religious or even moral justification, the traditionalist says no, there are higher laws. International law can bind these states and commit them to saying whether or not a war is just or unjust. These laws include things like the claim that countries may start a war for self-defense, but not for just active aggression, or that they may not target civilians during a war. Now, revisionists, on the other hand, question the moral sufficiency of international law, often claiming that for a war to be morally justified, or for actions in war to be morally justified, they must go above and beyond international law. And different revisionists are going to do this in different ways. For some revisionists, any action done by a soldier who is fighting for an unjust cause, short of laying down their weapons, is immoral, even if they're working within the bounds of international law, or even if international law would sanction the state but not the individual soldier. For the revisionist, the soldier is answerable to a morality as opposed to just their government being. Or that national defense doesn't always justify wars of retribution, that if someone's airplane barely goes over your airspace, it isn't justifiable for you to engage in a disproportionate attack against them. Revisionists might claim that we cannot actually implement these standards, perhaps, into international law, though not all revisionists would, for practical reasons, but that the standards for morality are above and beyond what we could possibly implement into international law. Now, finally, we would be remiss to cover this topic without mentioning the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And I think it can provide an illustrative example of some of these positions. Such a war, and the potential for that war to spiral outside of Ukraine's borders, challenges the abolitionists' claim that the threat of thermonuclear war can sustain the long peace. And the answer to that we may see in the next weeks. It has been described by many philosophers and the international community writ large as an unjust war because it is unprovoked, has involved the targeting civilians, is arguably against international law, and the only justification for it is based on lies. Wars like this seem to provide evidence for the need for something like just war theory, because it seems that the Ukrainian army is acting justly in defending their homeland, despite the fact that they are waging war, but that the Russian leaders, at least, are in the wrong, if not the Russian soldiers themselves. It seems challenging for the pacifist to claim that all Ukrainians should lay down their weapons because war is always wrong, and let Russia simply take over their state. But it is similarly challenging for the realist to claim that Putin is acting perfectly moral, or there aren't any moral standards on which we can judge him for invading a country despite no provocation whatsoever, and attacking civilians. This is just scraping the surface of the philosophy of war. What do you think? Is war inevitable? Can a lasting peace be achieved? Is war always right? Is it always wrong? If some wars are justifiable and some are not, what makes those wars justifiable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Hit subscribe if you like this video and you want to see more, and of course that notification bell so you can always stay updated on new videos that we publish. And stay skeptical, everybody.